What are the three key questions facing the 2023 Jacksonville Jaguars in fantasy football heading into training camp? It's time to break down Trevor Lawrence and the rest of the team as we begin another edition and close another week of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL and fantasy football for sportingnews.com. We're in the middle of our key series here, breaking down all 32 teams before they open up training camp. We're deep into the AFC South. We're into our third team, the Jacksonville Jaguars. We just covered the Houston Texans, Indianapolis Colts, looking at the three key questions facing every team for fantasy and trying to get the best answers for them as we go into camp. So a lot of good stuff to talk about. We will get to the Jaguars, an exciting team from last year, finished strong offensively, a lot of fantasy football possibilities. So Texans and Colts, a little limited on that capacity, but Jaguars, a great, exciting young team to talk about as the reigning AFC South champ. So that means we looked at a lot of the NFC teams, every single one, 16 there for you, and we're almost done with the AFC teams on deck. We'll have the Tennessee Titans and the entire AFC West to look at next week as well. So a lot of stuff to wrap up our season previews here for every team. Thanks again for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen today. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe and follow for free on YouTube and elsewhere here. It's part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, your fantasy football team every day as well. All right, it's time to dive into the first key question. Do we trust Calvin Ridley again as a fantasy football wide receiver too? So Calvin Ridley's had a couple years off essentially here. He hasn't played all that much there with the suspension for gambling last year, had the disappearance the year before with the issues off the field, probably related to this. So now Calvin Ridley comes back. He's had a couple years off. When we last saw Calvin Ridley, he ascended all the way up to wide receiver 4 in half-point PPR. That's how good he was. He was essentially the go-to guy. The changing of the guard in Atlanta had him as the top receiver in fantasy over a fading Julio Jones. Before that, he had a pretty good year as well. He finished as wide receiver 25 in half-point PPR and overall scoring wide receiver 17. So he was in the right trajectory to have a big season there a couple years ago. So hard to believe we haven't seen Calvin Ridley in an effective receiving role for a while, but this is pretty aggressive, right? According to the expert consensus rankings, all the way up to wide receiver 20. This is very aggressive indeed. When you look at what the Jaguars have lost, 113 vacated targets overall. Marvin Jones is responsible for most of those, 83. You also have a couple of the tight ends that are no longer there, Dan Arnold and Chris Manhertz. They had 21. So those are the most guys responsible for their vacated targets. You look at what Marvin Jones put up last year. He had a solid 46 receptions, 529 yards, and 3 TDs. Not bad as a number 3 receiver. Now let's look at where the receivers finished last year. Christian Kirk coming over in the big free agent deal from the Cardinals. Wide receiver 11 overall scoring, so he was a wide receiver 1 there. Fell down to wide receiver 2 when you look at half-point PPR average of wide receiver 19. He's ranked now at wide receiver 28. And you had actually a second viable starting receiver there in Zay Jones. Finished as wide receiver 26. Average scoring wide receiver 35. So either way, a wide receiver 3 in the top 36. Now he's ranked wide receiver 52. That's in relation to Calvin Ridley getting on the board at wide receiver 20. Now let's look at the numbers that Kirk and Zay Jones put up last year as newcomers to the Jaguars and see what Ridley can do in relation to them now as the newcomer. 254 targets combined, very healthy number, 166 combined catches, 1,931 yards and 13 TDs, and then you add that in the mix. So close to 2,500 yards, 16 TDs there, and more than 200 reception between those three players. So there's going to be the immediate opportunity for Ridley to swallow up what Marvin Jones Jr. did. and then cut into what Christian Kirk and Zay Jones do here, inside or outside. Ridley can line up as a big slot and make some plays there. He's a very good outside receiver as well. He's got some versatility, run routes, but this is a very low-risk, high-reward move by the Jaguars, pairing him up with Trevor Lawrence. And Lawrence is going to look to Ridley. He's a smart quarterback, young on the rise. Kirk is a special player, but he's meant to be a slot, quickness type guy. You have Zay Jones. He's always been a complimentary receiver. He was that to Kirk last year. But Ridley has that alpha mentality, and we've seen it in fantasy before with the Falcons. So, yeah, I think Calvin Ridley, look at where the targets can come from. There's a good baseline where he'll steal some of the work that we saw, those 13 TDs, 1,931 yards, 166 catches. Some of that will kind of go towards Ridley. So maybe you look at these guys around 1,500 yards at the most, or 1,400. So there's a good chunk going to Ridley and making it potential 1,000-yard season, maybe getting 6 to 10 touchdowns in there. He's a good scorer. We know from his days in Atlanta as well. He's a good red zone threat. So however you look at it, Calvin Ridley, everything points to him really having a big impact on this team. Again, the vacant targets are enough where you can cut into Jones' role. That's Marvin Jones, and cut more into Zay and Kirk's role here and really be a big target. He can also steal and siphon off a few of the targets that Evan Ingram got at tight end because there's some crossover with his usage on the inside. So a lot of good stuff to look at, but Calvin Ridley in a perfect situation to have a big rebound season. The only question is, what is the situation, rust versus rest, having that time off? He should be rejuvenated. He's on the right team. It's an upward spiral here with one Lawrence at quarterback. So maybe he had to hit his wall and max there with Matt Ryan, and it would not have really done too much with Marcus Mariota. So this is a good rejuvenation opportunity as Ridley gets to resume his career in Jacksonville. So our second question we will ask about his quarterback, a new quarterback, Trevor Lawrence. We'll have that for you. Then we'll also look at Travis Etienne Jr. and what's up with his new look backfield in Jacksonville. So we'll get to those topics here by the end of the show and the end of the week here as we continue our look at the key questions for all 32 teams in the NFL. As we continue with the AFC South and the Jaguars, I am proud to tell you that this episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by eBay Motors. We've teamed up with our partners at eBay Motors to hone in on some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week eBay and I are going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So with draft prep underway for the upcoming season, let's jump into this week's eBay Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. Austin Eckler is our spotlight player. Which running back has scored the most touchdowns combined the past two seasons? That's right. It would be electric Los Angeles Chargers back Austin Eckler, who's 38 scores since 2021 and featured receiving first role, make him a guaranteed fit for the first overall pick in 2023 fantasy football drafts. Eckler will see his usual high leverage work as a runner and remain the focal point of the short passing game in Los Angeles. I know a thing or two about trying to win a fantasy football championship with eBay Motors. You know, they know a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. With eBay Guaranteed Fit and over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Just like your fantasy football team, air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternators, shocks, you name it, eBay Motors has it. They'll have everything you can imagine at eBay for your parts at eBay Motors. And they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car because eBay Guaranteed Fit helps you understand exactly what part you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forward, switch gears, crank the AC, and say goodbye to sweating if your ride needs a little fixing up because now you know you'll always be set up for success from the get-go with eBay Guaranteed Fit. Everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right price at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. All right, it is time to continue the show here on Locked On Fantasy Football. We're looking at the Jaguars and the key fantasy football questions facing them as they go into training camp. So good stuff to break down with them. Thanks again for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen today. Every day, that means we've got the last team we'll look at in the AFC South up next. That would be the Tennessee Titans. If you missed anything in the archives, again, all 16 NFC teams are up, as well as almost all the teams there in the AFC. We just have a few more to go, but we covered the entire AFC East, AFC North as well, and we're our third team in the South. So catch our archives to get the offseason analysis preview you need ahead of the preseason. All right, it is time to look at the next key question facing the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2023. How high is the ceiling for Trevor Lawrence as a QB1? That's a good question. I think we have to look at it in relation to other quarterbacks here. And the other thing is we got to see where Trevor Lawrence was last year in his trajectory. So he finished as the QB8 overall, the QB12 in terms of average points per game. So right there, however you look at it, as a back-end QB1 in 12-team leagues. He is ranked at QB8 this year. Let's look at the numbers from last year, really boosted by his rushing total, by the way. 4,113 yards. We're always looking for that number. 25 touchdowns, only 8 interceptions. This is the kicker, 291 rushing yards with 5 TDs. So he got to the 30 TD mark. That's pretty key to becoming a quarterback one in fantasy football. You look at 9 games over 18 points and 4 out of the last 7 weeks after the Jaguars bye, where they got really red hot going into the playoffs and were able to complete that big comeback against the Chargers and make the divisional playoffs. So they got really hot in the second half of the season, on fire, won a lot of games. Part of that was Trevor Lawrence putting up some big numbers. And you look at what they did last year, 59% of the time they threw with Doug Peterson and Press Taylor with their offensive leadership. So they'll probably stick with that a little bit more. Now, it's interesting to see after the first year, that includes Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen, who's ranked ahead of Trevor Lawrence. You have Lamar Jackson. Okay, makes sense with the running. Joe Burrow with his production. Yeah, absolutely. You look at Justin Fields. Okay. Then you get to Justin Herbert. Maybe you would look at Herbert and Burrow, 2 pocket passers types, where you're not going to get that running cheat code, where Lawrence might actually have a little bit more of that. So, again, the upside is there. I don't think you can go too much higher. Again, with Mahomes and Allen and Hurts pretty established as consistent forces. Really, the highest you can go with Trevor Lawrence really is QB4, and that's still pretty good. So you can get a QB8 in the rankings. If he lasts longer than that, people look at his average scoring, you're headed to a steal here, because I think he can easily put up more points than Herbert here in 2023 with Ridley in the mix. I think he has top 5 upside because of Ridley adding that extra target to what he has. He had good chemistry with Kirk and Jones. You had Ridley. You have Evan Ingram still in the mix. Pretty good depth there overall. At tight end, you just have enough weapons here for Lawrence to put up the numbers. And again, that running is going to be a part of what he does. He's just too good of an athlete. He's smart in the red zone. That was a big part of what he did at Clemson as well. So those numbers will be there. I don't see a big regression there. You could see actually more rushing yardage, maybe the touchdown taper off a little bit here, but that could also mean it sets him up to throw more passing touchdowns as well. Ridley, excellent red zone scorer here to add to the mix there. So touchdowns definitely can get a boost overall. The rushing and the passing could see the numbers go up as well. So he's got a pretty high floor. He's one of the safest picks, I think, when you go out of the big tier of QBs. I think there's a little bit of volatility with these other quarterbacks that run all the time. They get hurt. Herbert was a little bit disappointing last year as well. So, again, Lawrence has the least kind of concerns that we're going to look at there as a back-end QB1 that can turn out to be real steal. Again, QB5 upside does exist based on the weaponry and his overall talent and ability in this offense made for him. Keep in mind, Carson Wentz put up a big fantasy football season with Peterson the year that they got to the Super Bowl before he got hurt and Nick Foles took over. So Lawrence can definitely put up those type of numbers and really shoot past that key number, the 30 touchdowns combined. All right, there you have 2 key questions asked about the Jaguars passing game. We'll save our last question to be about their backfield and what happens with Travis Etienne Jr. So that'll be the focus there as we close our look at the Jaguars here in 2023. Thanks again for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Now make your second listen after the show, Locked On NFL. Before we get to our final segment, I do have to tell you that this episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is also brought to you by Bird Dogs. What do you get with Bird Dog shorts? They do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but fit way better. They fit better than regular shorts because they're not made of that stiff, restricting cotton. Bird Dogs fix this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches, so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. And the best thing is you can stay cool and dry all day long because Bird Dogs is going to use anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you good on the go. And if you want to transition to a night out or just sitting on the patio, Bird Dogs has got you covered there. So Bird Dogs, I can't say enough. They have really comfortable clothes, shorts and pants that are going to make you feel good. Again, especially in the summer when you need to cool off and need something there that you can wear and not think about changing too much. And I do have a special thing that I have to tell you. There's a free Yeti style tumbler that you'll get now if you're watching on YouTube. I'll share it with you right now. Here it is, the Bird Dogs tumbler that you will get with your order. And really, again, the comfort level's there. And then you get this free gift, and you can't beat that. So you just go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL or enter the promo code LockedOnNFL for a free Yeti style tumbler. Again, if you need to see it, it's beautiful. It's nice. You can take it anywhere. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL or promo code LockedOnNFL for a free Yeti style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you they're cool and comfy all summer long. All right, it is time to close the show here on Locked On Fantasy Football and break down the last question we want to get answers to from the Jacksonville Jaguars. Should we be worried about Travis Etienne, his usage, his role, and therefore his fantasy football production here in 2023? Now, it was great for Travis Etienne, a semi-breakout season. They committed to James Robinson early. We know they moved him in the middle of the season to the Jets, and that really helped, of course. Travis Etienne finished as RB17 last year overall, pretty good. RB24 in terms of average scoring and half-point PPR. He's ranked aggressively at RB13, but this ignores a few facts. They do have 81 vacated carries, 90 overall touches. Those are all from James Robinson. Started out as a key role member there with 81. Those rushes turned into 340 yards, 3 TDs. You had 9 catches and a little bit of help there. But when you look overall, James Robinson gone, and now you have the ability to get someone who's going to be a little bit more involved overall. I mean, 93, 86, and 4 was the total number that James Robinson leaves behind. So significant yardage that you can look at. But here's the problem. They have hinted at, especially Press Taylor, the offense coordinator, a little bit diminished role. They want to keep Etienne a little fresher in games. They really rode him hard in the second half of last season where he was pretty consistently an RB1 to make up for a slow start with Robinson in the mix having a key role. They did draft Tank Bigsby out of Auburn, a very good power back. They also still have Jermichael Hasty, a dedicated crossover receiving type. And they also added Dearness Johnson. Remember him? He had nice stints there for the Browns when Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt weren't available. He was a big fantasy football asset, helped them win a game, put up 100 yards. So he has some potential plug and play. This offensive line is still pretty good. They will have Cam Robinson suspended early, but still a pretty good front here to run the ball. But yeah, you add 2 backs to replace Robinson essentially in Bigsby and Johnson. So that is definitely a concern because, again, Johnson is a good overall back. Hasty is a good receiving back. Bigsby is a good finisher. With the power there, Bigsby is right now listed as the number 2. So Etienne, they're not going to totally diminish the fact that he's a very talented back and they want him on the field to put up some numbers. But I think it's a bit aggressive to push him all the way up to RB13, which puts him at a borderline RB1, just out of the top 12. I think you have to look in the other way, that maybe a little bit more committee approach, rest Etienne. They've hinted at it. Look, it could be just coach speak and they want to just put all the carries on him. But there's also the practical thing to think about that Etienne is a smaller back, and you don't really want to grind him to pulp. He's a special back that you want to keep dynamic to make some big plays, so you don't want to wear him down too much. So if you can get 15 effective touches, you'll do it over forcing him into 20 touches per game. I mean, that can make a significant difference when you have that 25% decrease in the workload. And just taking the hits and all that, I think they'll be careful that Etienne, know they have depth, know they have offensive line, know that their passing game is dangerous. Has a little bit more pop there with Ridley joining Kirk and Jones. So again, they'll be careful. Etienne will be a good compliment. He'll get it with his scoring here in 2023. That'll be a big part of what he does. They'll use him there. But definitely they can cut into his workload in the passing game even more and try to keep him fresh to be more effective as a pure runner here. So, yes, I think you should be worried, but not to the point you're going to drop him off and do not draft Travis Etienne. But drafting him close to RB1 just because the situation doesn't have James Robinson doesn't make any sense with Bigsby and Johnson in the mix. To diminish role possible, extra receiving work going to actual wide receivers, a little bit more depth at tight end. So, yeah, everything lines up to say the Jaguars should be throwing more than 59% of the time with the weapons they have and having the running game complementing and kind of finishing out games for them as a more established contender where they're not on the rise, not trying to play catch up with some teams. So that could also hurt the value of Etienne overall. So Again, I'm just going to pump the brakes, say again, more of an RB2, well buried there versus borderline RB1. That's how I'm going to look at the value this year of Travis Etienne in relation to this passing game. He will get involved there, but not as much as you think. And the running game, just not totally what the Jaguars are going to dedicate to pounding it with him this season. So there you have it. There's a look at the 3 key questions surrounding the Jaguars here ahead of 2023. Thanks again for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Everydayers. Our next show will focus on the Tennessee Titans, the last team from the AFC South, and we'll focus on the AFC West with the Denver Broncos, Kansas City Chiefs, Las Vegas Raiders, and Los Angeles Chargers. So we'll finish all those teams for you next week as wraps up right before training camp. Thanks again for listening to Locked On Fantasy Football. This has been Vinnie Iyer. Have a great day, and make sure you check out Locked On NFL and all the great shows on the network. Catch you next time with a look at the Tennessee Titans.